Welcome everyone to this month's recording of Service in Sport, both a Zoominar and a podcast where we're talking with people around the world about sports chaplaincy, character coaching, how to develop in those things. We have two outstanding guests today, along with my outstanding co-host, Marla Butterworth. She's sitting in Southern California today, enjoying that. And we're excited for the guests we have. Unique set of people here in that we all have a common interest in sports chaplaincy and character coaching, but we come at it from decidedly different backgrounds and ways of how we've come to gather the things that equip us for this. One of our guests, Whitmore, is he's a campus pastor, in a sense, a school minister at Mercersburg Academy in Pennsylvania. He has a great distinguished career in academia with a bachelor's degree from the University of Denver, then a master's of divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. And he's just completed a PhD from Gloucestershire University in England on sports chaplaincy. Our other guest, Paul Putz, is at Truett Seminary at Baylor University, and Paul is a PhD, having received his degree from Grace University and then a PhD at Baylor. And his writing and research has been on places like Christianity Today, Slate, NPR, Religious News Service. He's got a book in process of being published now at Oxford University Press. So phenomenal credentials for those guys from the academic side. And then Marla Butterworth comes to us from both the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and the military chaplaincy corps in the Air Force right now, still a reserve chaplain there. And so has a great experience both from a formal training side, but also a rich history in practice of doing it. And then here comes me with a long time history of doing things, but no academic credentials. And at the same time, a really broad network of colleagues from around the world from whom I've been able to learn. And so anyway, we have pretty broad perspectives here. The big idea of the day is to talk about how we become great students of this process, of this role as being a character coach or a sports chaplain. How do you learn and grow and develop over time? Marla, I think you have some opening thoughts about this.
Yeah, sure. Kind of some food for thought. I'm going to toss out to these gentlemen and just ask y'all to reflect on it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? But I want to introduce you all to a guy that played basketball in college with me. I played soccer. He played basketball. We were athletes there together. And he said of his basketball coach that guy had coached, not coached 30 years, but he had coached the same year 30 times. That was how he spoke of his coach. And then later on, after graduating, no longer an eligibility child, I was coaching, attending one of these coaching seminars. They said, when you quit being a student of the game, you need to get out of coaching. And just those two thoughts really collided in my mind as a 25-year-old at the time coaching. Going, all right, how do I sharpen my axe? How do I always keep learning? How do I stay relevant? Things like that. So to our guests, and then Roger, if you guys would jump in on this, what do you think about that thought process? When you quit being a student of the game, you need to get out of coaching. How do we be a student of the game in terms of character coaching, sports chaplaincy? Would you agree with that thought or edit it to some degree? Go ahead, Paul.
All right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can hop in here. So, the first thought I have, actually, I think of what it means to be a student of the game. My dad was a full-time UPS driver, pastored a church too. So he's doing both those things. Didn't have a college degree at all. But over the course of his life was constantly reading, learning, and growing as he was pastoring. And I just remember him being willing to see where God might be moving, what blind spots he might have. And he did this in a sort of a self-taught way, but with a sense of turning to wise authors or wise leaders. So we saw kind of in a fundamentalist background is where I grew up, but over the course of my, 18 years living in that house, there was just a movement more towards grace, towards sort of a freedom in Christ that comes when we're rooted in him. And I saw my dad modeled that. And I've really taken that with me in my own journey, which put me into academia. It's always reminded me of the way that learning happens, which is not necessarily through a formal credential, but instead is through a curiosity, sort of an intrinsic motivation to care for others. And so when I think of what it means to be a student of the game, I think absolutely this is something that chaplains, that all of us should be doing in whatever field we're a part of, whatever space God has put us. We should be thinking about our craft, but more importantly about how we can care for others, how we can love others well in our spaces. So to the extent that we're motivated by that desire, then I think it's a great thing to continue to hone what we do and to do it well.
Your dad's my hero. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think, Paul, you make a great point. And first, thank you guys for having us. And it's exciting to be here. Paul and I spent some time together about 6 weeks ago. And so it's great to get to do it again in this way. I think that statement goes for everything in life. When we stop trying to learn how to be better, parents, better husbands, spouses, wives, significant others, stop trying to be good community members. When we realize that we think that we've reached that limit, that tends to be where the challenges and the pitfalls come in. So here at the Academy, I teach a number of religion courses. And while the structure is is the same every term for these set courses, it's the days that I assume that I don't need to prep that my classes go the worst. And that's because I've assumed I've got this down pat today. So I'll just be fine. I've done this reading 3 times this year. We're on a trimester system. This happens particularly in the spring when I've read the book twice already. I don't need to look it over. I don't need to refresh in that space. And those are the classes I come out of going, I could have done a better job as that person there. And so I think we're constantly learning and constantly engaging. And sports chaplaincy and character coaching is an inherently relational field. So we are always engaging with someone else. And anytime we come to a relationship that we are the only person who can provide that information, we cannot learn from them, that it's how we engage sets that full tone. I don't really see that as a relationship. That power dynamic has shifted in a way that we're not going to be able to give the stewardship and the guidance that we can in that space when we close ourselves off to the possibilities of what a relationship can be like. So I think in a relational field in particular, we're always learning and engaging, particularly with young people. I work with high school students primarily. I'm going to assume that many of you work with either high school or collegiate level students. And so we're dealing with different cultural and social factors and how those things grow and change over time. And that in itself requires us to maintain a level of relevance to what these young people are dealing with through these formative years.
Sure. Roger, do you have anything you want to add before I go on to our next question? You're on mute, Roger.
I think those guys nailed it, that it's a lifelong process of development. I mean, I'm 65, but I'm thrilled that my reading and my comprehension of reading is faster now and better than it was at 35. But we're not done yet. And you've got to stay at it. And I'm thrilled with the way Will mentioned that it is intensely relational. It has to be done that way. And you have to keep studying the nuances of culture because they change all the time.
Yeah, for sure. So go ahead.
One of the thoughts that came to my mind, Martha, Marla, is if I'm not internally motivated, then I need to really evaluate if this is where I really need to be. Because if I'm not internally motivated from a biblical perspective, then I guess the analogy would be a player whose heart is really not into it, and so he's never going to be able to meet the expectation. So that was one of the thoughts that came to my mind as you were asking that question.
For sure, yeah. Our internal motivations driving what you guys were saying about basically I'm hearing a growth mindset, intensely relational for the sake of the gospel primarily, but then also relevance. I mean, that's the vehicle through which they're going to hear it. So with that being the case, how do we maintain that growth mindset? Let's go conceptual first, then we'll dig down into some of the brass tacks there. But just in a more conceptual way, how do we learn and grow? So Paul and Will, what have you seen, or what would you recommend as essential elements of a character coach's professional development plan? Okay, so I realize I need to keep being a student of the game. What are the big things, the big rocks that I should focus on?
Well, you can start with this one.
Sounds good. I think, Marla, you made a really good point there when you said, what should be my plan? And I think that word plan does a lot of work there. I don't know where you all are at, but I work a 6-day-a-week job. I have 2 kids, a third on the way, 5 or 6 other things I'm trying to balance. And professional development often is that last checklist that we go, we'll just add that one to next week. We'll just push this one back a little bit, or things like that. And that happens in all of our lives. That's not to say I'm trying to beat myself up, or you guys as well. But having a plan and being consistent with it is really, I think, a huge help, and varying that too. I do a lot of reading and a lot of podcast listening for professional development. But if I'm only doing self-directed development that I'm picking and choosing, and I'm only really prioritizing how I'm reading something or how I'm listening to it without talking to someone else or hearing their opinions or getting those different perspectives, that can be, I think, a real challenge. Obviously, reading a book or doing something on your own is that easy space because you can fit it in. Okay, I've got 30 minutes today because my kid's practice is running long. I can do that. But if that's our only thing, we can become a little bit of an echo chamber in that way. And so providing other perspectives and hearing those and allowing people to pour into you in those ways, I think is really a huge help in that regard. So coming up with some form of a consistent plan, manageable, but consistent. Okay, I want to talk to 3 people in the next 9 months. I want to read these books. I'd like to join a coffee group that meets once a month. What are these small things that I can do in that way that chip away in those things, that creates that plan? And then, like I said, one that engages and interacts with others. So as Roger had mentioned, I just defended my PhD, and I talked with chaplains in the NFL and the English Premier League. And one of the big things we saw in their professional development was it was primarily self-directed, and a lot of the times it was that internal space. Very few of those guys had someone who was observing them in their work or providing critique. And very few of them had a consistent engagement with someone who they could learn both theologically and Bible-based stuff from, but also practical skills or engage and interact. And I think when we get into that brass tacks, I want to touch on how we read about God and our faith versus how we develop skills, and seeing those things as both important. But I want to give Paul a chance to pop in there as well.
Yeah, well, that covers a lot of really important ideas. And I should come in here and say, I come at this, I'm not a character coach or chaplain. As a historian, I've studied this. I do work with people at Baylor. I work with our sports chaplain at Baylor University. So I work with people who do that. We have people take some of our classes, but that's not what I do. And so I've actually often found in my relationships with character coaches and sports chaplain, it's really a mutual learning that happens. The things that I bring to the table can help character coaches and chaplains. The things they bring to the table help me better understand what they do and the cultures and the sort of the expectations and the roles that they play. So it's a mutual process. I do think the intentionality is really important, and it can be something as simple as, what do you do, before you go to bed? Is it sort of just scrolling through your phone for 20 minutes, or do you have a book or a podcast or something that you can sort of close the day just with short chunks of something meaningful? It might be a different time of the day, after you've gotten into scripture, after you've, sort of developed your spiritual life, spent time with God. What are some of those ways you can grow, and how do you build those into your structures? I think that can be important, but there does need to be something that is outside of your own individual growth, like Will said. And that can happen a lot of times from sort of an outside space. There could be opportunities if there's a seminary close by. You could think it doesn't have to be a class about sports, right? You could take a class that's helping you understand the Bible better, or there's pastoral care classes or chaplaincy classes that aren't sports chaplaincy. And I think if you can really learn from some of those classes or opportunities for continuing education, even if it's not a 4-credit class, I think there are those opportunities to continue to hone and refine what you do. But I would say the looking outside of the individual part of it, finding some sort of space where you get feedback, where you have someone investing in you, can be really important. And my sense from a lot of the sports chaplains or character coaches I talk with is that there is a sense of relationship. In fact, this itself, what Roger and Marla do and provide is part of learning and growing. You have a community, which is really important. But it can be really lonely at times when you don't have people around you. You're within a team and you're ministering to a whole team, but who's ministering to you? Who is it that's investing in your life and helping you learn and grow? So being able to find those people, those spaces, those organizations, and finding them outside of maybe your own sort of close friend group, but people who can speak into it in ways that help you get feedback and evaluation and perspective that can then help you grow. I think looking for those opportunities, being intentional about it, is a good way to go to kind of take a first step.
For sure. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you guys say is that some of the most common avenues are both learning about sports, learning about your faith, learning about chaplaincy character coaching through all manner of books, podcasts, whatever. But probably what you would say is most valuable is the interconnectedness of the feedback, honestly, for the skill of. Am I summarizing both of your thoughts fairly decently there?
Definitely. And I think you do a really great job, once again, of framing that, learning the skill of chaplaincy or character coaching. There are skills to pastoral care that are different than exegeting the Bible or planning a sermon or doing certain things. And those skills can be honed over time, can be learned from different disciplines and things of that nature. And so seeing that as a skill acquisition is really helpful.
Oh, for sure. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
I was just going to add to that. I think there's also a sense in which you've probably developed skills without understanding it. And if you begin to learn how to articulate and reflect on the own skills that you have, if you take the time to write down, what do I do and why do I do it and what works well? Because I think intuitively, all of you probably do things really well in relating to others. But sometimes even intentionally reflecting on that, just taking the time to think through what do I do can be a good way to kind of figure out how you can grow, but also affirm those pieces of what you do that are really effective. Again, I think it can happen naturally, and building in spaces to reflect, which often happens through those intentional settings that we've talked about, can be really meaningful and powerful to kind of continue your growth.
Totally agree.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and flesh that out, because that's been share this with the group. That's been part of my experience. So Roger mentioned there's the military background working. I started with the Navy and switched over to the Air Force. And part of that onboarding process with them, they actually had us do what you were just saying, Paul. We had to write from a variety of faith traditions. We all were sitting in this room, and had to write our philosophy of ministry, our philosophy of chaplaincy. They actually kind of tease that one out a little bit too, because so many people were coming with a pastoral mindset, but then into this diverse, pluralistic institutional setting, and so how do I maintain my love for Jesus and who I am, but then also walk into the space where not everybody thinks, feels, looks the way I do. And so how does my philosophy come to bear on that? And just that exercise, they really wanted it to be like one page, very succinct. And it was formative for us. It wasn't because they were going to judge our answer. They wanted us to maintain our faith traditions and distinctives, but they wanted us to be able to think through it that way. And then the other thing that's been so valuable for me too, I don't know, everybody learns a different way. But for me, I think it's consistent for a lot of people. If I can explain it articulately to you, then I know it. If I can teach it, then I've learned it. And so some of the best things that's developed me as well is building some training things for my colleagues within FCA. And so it's helped me figure out how do I do this succinctly? How do I do this in a way that they'll understand? But also so many of us learn by doing. Back to the what you guys were talking about in community for feedback. So a lot of what I've built has baked in, not bolted on, but baked into it. Okay, go do this, get feedback. Here's a rubric you can hand somebody who knows nothing about sports chaplaincy, and they can judge you and provide you some valuable feedback. And everybody who's kind of gone through that has valued two major things about it. Number one, that practical, tangible, objective feedback that they can get from anybody, even, you know, their spouse or somebody that might not be doing this field. And then secondly, a lot of guys who've been doing this, who go through it, that have been doing this profession for a while, they've appreciated the community aspect of it, to hear how somebody else does it. Oh, I've never thought about it that way. And that's been the hugest growth for myself, both in FCA and a military context, is being around people who are different than me and learning how they do things. So I don't know if I figure for the good of the crew, put some skin on to the concepts y'all were mentioning, what it's looked like in my life. Anything to reflect on, Paul, Will, or Roger, if you want to add anything?
I think I'll add, I think you bring up a great point of learning from those differences, particularly when we're talking about approaches to ministry or those skills. We can remain distinctly Christian chaplains and learn how a Jewish chaplain approaches a grief ministry and how those skill-based elements in that engagement, and still maintain our authenticity in Christ and our belief in that Savior. But learn those skills in those ways. One place I would suggest looking for that is the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, which is out of Boston. They do a lot of webinars, and some of their top webinars are on things like healthcare chaplaincy and hospices, or hospice chaplaincy, or grief and chaplaincy, and things like that. And so you are going to hear on a webinar recorded like that various different religious perspectives. But you know, in my own ministry, boy, I wish I could go back and do a few of those death and grieving situations over. I learned a lot real quick in those that way. And having those experiences to hear from others, even in other traditions, the do's and don'ts they've learned, I can take those skills and apply them to my Christian faith and my Christian witness. And so the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab can be a really great spot for that. Those resources, they're very good with resources, webinars, and they have a newsletter that comes out that can be really helpful. So that's a spot. I was thinking of that as you brought that up, Marla.
Good. Roger, you were going to add something there?
Nope. I was just going to say, I heard Will as a guest on that podcast, and it was outstanding episode.
Cool. Thank you for throwing that resource. We'll toss it in the show notes for everybody as well. Mm-hmm. So let's get into the specifics now, guys. So we're going to start first with, I'm trying to remember how you worded it, Will, but that self, the internal learning, so to speak. So books, podcasts, websites, whatever, that kind of thing. So gentlemen, what kinds of resources are out there for developing skills and knowledge? You already mentioned this one here, but where do character coaches and sports chaplains find these resources? And then if I can throw a second question there, there's no lack of information out there. Google search, you're going to find a ton of things. How do you know if it's good? How do you know if it's legitimate and reputable?
Well, start just by following Roger, because he's always sharing resources. So if you're doing that, you're in a good spot. I think the Sport Faith Life. So that's a really good resource. It's a website, it's a blog, it's a podcast, and it's not specific to character coaching or sports chaplaincy, but they get a lot of interesting voices that they'll have featured that think about sports culture, usually from a more academic perspective, but also that connects with practitioners. So that, I think that can be a good one. At the Faith and Sports Institute, where I work, we have some certificate classes. So we have a sort of a continuing education. It's a non-credit professional development program with online classes on theology in sports, mental health in sports, topics like race or leadership. And they're framed around, Christian foundation, but drawing on academic resources too, and also sort of set in a practical way. And, I found we've had a number of sports chaplains and character coaches from FCA or AIA or other organizations who have come through the classes. It's helpful for some of them. So that can be one option. I know there are other classes and spaces out there too that do similar stuff. Over in the UK, there's Christians in Sport, which is a good sports ministry organization, and their website has lots of resources. Sometimes looking at kind of how they do things in the UK is, I think, helpful to frame it for the US setting, because they have a real good way of being rooted in the gospel, but also really winsome and approaching leadership and care in a way that reflects the need to be attentive to pluralism and diversity. So I found some really good resources there. And like you said, Marla, there's so much out there. There's so much information. And so I do think the danger is we can quickly just become consumers of information instead of letting it form and shape us. And so to just be rooted in find some helpful resources for a season in your life to go through, but try to go through them deeply and reflectively. I think that's more important than just getting as much as you can.
Yeah, Paul brings up a lot of those good points. It's nice when we can agree in these ways, that's for sure. I think asking people what they're reading and how they've been shaped and formed can be really helpful. Or reaching out to someone like a Roger or myself or a Paul or other people in your life, those people in your own sports chaplaincy life, or Marla. Sorry, I should also include Marla too in that way. Hey, this is a space I want to grow in. What is something that's been worked for you in this way? Because Marla, you're right. There is so much information that sometimes honing that down can be really tricky in those ways. When it comes to books, I also like to reach out to old professors that I've had, or find people I know who are teaching currently in the field and ask if they will share a syllabus with me. And then go and procure those types of things. A great one I read because of one like that was a book called Here If You Need Me, A True Story by Kate Braystrop. And Kate Braystrop is a Unitarian minister up in New Hampshire, but she is the chaplain for the New Hampshire, essentially like the game commission, where when somebody gets like lost in the woods or someone falls through the ice, they're the people who have to go search and rescue that. So you're dealing with a lot of traumatic things like that. And her own journey to chaplaincy was led through her husband dying as a member of the state police there. And she talks about that grief and then becoming a chaplain through that. And that was a really powerful perspective in those ways. And that's a great example of, I don't share Kate's theological understandings of the world, but I can very much understand how she approaches this ministry and her subtleties and how she's allowed those things to shape. I do like having resources that are going to provide me varied contexts. I think as sports chaplains or character coaches at times, we can think I should only be reading about sports chaplains or character coaches. Finding books from other chaplaincy fields or things like that can provide us a lot of benefit there. When it comes to those things, unless it's a book like Kate's, which was very much supposed to be autobiographical, I tend to be wary of resources that talk more about the individual or the team they're working with than how they minister and function in those ways. Kate's book was intentionally autobiographical, so it focused on her. But if you're more interested in telling me about who you've worked with and the spaces you've gotten access to, as opposed to how this ministry is manifest, that's awesome, man. I'm really happy that you're so happy, but that doesn't help me become a better pastor or a better chaplain. I do feel bad. I had like 3 other resources I wanted to share that are books. I can see Paul reaching for his. They are tuning the organ in where my office is right now. And it is an excruciatingly painful sound. So I ran home at the last minute so we didn't have just horrid notes just shooting out. So I can, I'm going to have to go here in about 5 minutes because I teach our New Testament course in a few minutes. But I'll throw my email in the chat if people would like further resources and things of that nature. I'm happy to connect and things like that, also via Zoom and whatnot. But I think, yeah, asking where that approach is coming from. Is this person seeking to help me become a better chaplain, or are they seeking to show me just how awesome their ministry has been? And you know those people. You've met those people. And it's easy to smell those differences out. I just want to add one other thing there too. I think sometimes we get a little wary of too academic of work. Don't be wary of it. Plow through it, ask questions, reach out to people, seek to engage with that. There's really good stuff that can be distilled through those conversations in those places that can benefit ministry on a practical level. So I would encourage people who, I didn't really do this as a degree, or I didn't enjoy that school that much. If you have the interest to engage with it, do your best with it, and then find someone who can help work that way through it too. That's a space of empowerment in that way. So don't be afraid of that in that regard.
Good.
Yeah,
Let me
Will's
jump
telling
in.
me- Oh yeah, go ahead, Rod.
Yeah, I just want to, before we lose Will, I want to throw one more thing to him and we'll come right back to you, Paul. Just from a practical wisdom standpoint, Will, as you're thinking about sports chaplains, character coaches, those in your network, how is it that you see that they express their hunger to learn and develop? How do they kind of give you an indication that, hey, I'm anxious to grow. I want to learn something?
I think it's just, wonder is such a beautiful thing. The fact that God allows us to wonder and ask questions we're eager to answer is a sign of God's goodness, in my opinion. Because it shows that this mind we've been given can go in so many places and we can discover those things. So I think when people approach something with curiosity and engagement and intrigue, that gets me excited for learning. That's one reason I love being a teacher. And I ask my students that, if you're going to just focus on what you need to get done for a grade, you're going to receive a grade out of this class. But if you approach it with intrigue and wonder and engagement of what can be and what we can learn from it, that opens up a whole nother spectrum of life and of the beauty of God's creation and the beauty of the mind and experience God's allowed us to have, I think. So I get really excited about those things, and I see that in that way. I think there's also a level of humility that's important as well. Because to admit that we need to learn and to grow is to recognize that we are human beings and imperfect. And I do believe at times we all get nervous about those things. I just had a huge feedback this fall here. And the day I got that back, I didn't feel great about what I was going to find on those pieces of paper. It's a really vulnerable experience. But I can tell you I've grown from that space, and that's good. I would also argue too that that's the same when people ask about maintaining respectful boundaries and asking people to do things around those elements. It's not the suggestion that you're a terrible person, that bad things are going to happen. It's that continuing to grow and honor all people and engage in all those ways. So I think it's, seeing professional development and continued development, or learning about respectful relations, all those things as ways I can continue to hone my craft and grow and expand in this world in a way that honors me and those I work with, is a really good place to start. And when chaplains do that, it's great. I love nothing more than waking up and having an email in my inbox of someone I've never spoken to going, I'm interested in talking. Can we set up a Zoom? Heck yes, we can set up a Zoom. I would love to chat more and learn about you and what you're doing. And that, I think I'll just end on this, in Luke, in the gospel according to Luke, when Jesus sends out the 70, they go out in pairs. They don't go alone. They journey together. And our life in faith and our life in ministry and our life in growth should journey together. And what do? They proclaim the kingdom of God is drawn near. They don't have to convert everyone. They don't have to solve every problem. They don't have to do all these things. They just have to be a presence to know that this kingdom is near. And when we meet like this, when we share in life with one another and we engage in that way, we too proclaim that. We don't solve every problem. We don't fix every development thing, but we say this kingdom is near and we can continue to proclaim it. So here ends your sermon for the day. I apologize. I got a little preachy there. So
thank you, Will. I know you've got a jet. Will's email will be in the show notes if you're watching the recording. He's a great resource for us, a great colleague and friend. Thank you, Will. Appreciate you making time. There is his email in the chat. Paul, let me throw that question to you now in transition here related to how do people express their hunger to want to grow, and how do you perceive that?
Yeah, I actually was, one of when I was even thinking about our conversation, one of the passages in scripture that I often think about in my own work I think is relevant to that question. It's from Acts 17. You know, when Paul is in Athens and he's about to preach, he wants to speak to these people, and this is the famous part where he sees the inscription "To an unknown God," right? And if you read that passage, Paul talks about how he walks around and he looks carefully at your objects of worship. That's how Paul phrased it. I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. And that part has really stood out to me in my own work and why I study sports culture. Because when we study culture, a lot of times what we're doing is we are studying the objects of worship for people. And our job is to help them see that thing that you find your identity in, that you treasure, your object of worship, isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but it's not a good God. And we want to help them see God as ultimate, and how that thing that they took as God is actually something that is created and meant to be used under the authority and stewardship of the one true God. So to the extent that we have a desire to understand the world around us, to study the objects of worship around us, I think we can effectively witness and care for people. It also gives us, I think, a little bit of a sense of empathy and humility. We don't come from a place of judgment at first. We come from a place of, what is it about this part of culture that expresses a deeply human desire to meet and find God? And if we start with trying to learn those pieces of culture, with younger generations or whoever it is that we work with, come to a place of wonder, curiosity, so that ultimately we can understand them, so that we can understand what it is that can help them see how that thing they desire is really ultimately only found in God. So I think that's a really big part of it. It's not curiosity for its own sake, although that can certainly be good, but it's ultimately seeking to help others find the source of their desires.
Good. Let me shift gears here just for a moment to think about interpersonal resources as opposed to books, or let's think about the persons in our networks that could be great resources to us. Both Paul and Marla, may I ask you, please, what would you say is the value of a character coach, a sports chaplain, seeking a relationship with a mentor or a coach, being connected with a network of other folks that do the same thing as you? How do you judge the value of those things, and how do you make those things of great value to you?
I've just found that relationships always help in any field that you're trying to grow in. Whether it's as an athlete, I always found that training with others, if I'm in the weight room, if I'm on when I was in the basketball court, having a friend that I was going through that with always helped. And then having a coach or a teacher or some sort of mentor who's maybe further along in some respects, maybe not in everything, but in some respects I could learn from them. That's always been helpful too. So I think it's the same principle in any task that we have. In my own, my sort of academic work, I've always had people that I've looked up to, that I've turned to ask questions about, that have mentored me, who have helped me grow. And so I think this is simply part of how God made us, in relationship with people that we get to learn from. And as a historian too, I think of it in terms of the way that we are part of a story that extends not even in our own circles, but it extends, years, into the past. Even this work of sports ministry and chaplaincy, in a certain sense, all of you, you're carrying on these traditions and stories and this legacy of ministry that began, decades before, and yet you're a part of that story because of what people before you have done. And so to see yourself as one part of this much larger relational work of God in the field of sports, I think is a really powerful thing. And then to also consider how you yourself can carry that story forward. Baylor, Bill, I don't know if you know Bill Glass. He was a Baylor football player, played in the NFL with the Cleveland Browns, just died on Sunday. And he, when Bill Glass entered the NFL, they did not have pregame chapel services. Didn't exist. Bill Glass came in 1958. Bill Glass, as a player, just began to meet with other players, other Christians, and just hold these services in his hotel room before games. Over time, that spread to other players in the NFL. Other Christian players start holding these services. Eventually, by the end of the 1960s, a minister named Doc Eshelman, he begins to organize and facilitate these pregame chapels. Eventually, Watson Spolstra, who was a sports writer who was mentored by Bill Glass, he takes the idea and brings it to Major League Baseball. And so by the 1970s, when Bill Glass has retired, every single NFL team and every single Major League Baseball team has pregame chapel services. They have chaplains in sports, something that didn't exist before Bill Glass entered into professional sports as a Christian. And he just saw a need in his own team and did something about it. And others came alongside and they helped each other grow and spread this idea to other spaces. And so, I've been thinking about him this week because he just passed away. But I think that's a reminder of how you don't do your own work alone. It's not only the people with you, it's the people who have come before you, and it's the people who will come after you. And so to the extent that you can find those who you work with, come alongside with, run the race with, as the passage in Hebrews tells us, I think that's a powerful thing.
Outstanding. Marla, you've had similar thoughts, I'm sure, and experiences with networks and mentors and such. What's your perspective on this thought?
Oh yeah, so that was how I entered this whole field. It was basically a academic year-long apprenticeship, if you will, at Auburn University. To your point, Paul, Coach Tuberville had won the Coach of the Year award there the year prior, and he was getting all kinds of, as he was giving acceptance speeches, he credit his offensive coordinator, his defensive coordinator, his spiritual coordinator. For whatever reason, people, their motivation, but they started calling Auburn saying, how do we get a chaplain? And that was part of then the chaplain training program that developed. I got to walk through and learn how to do this in an apprenticeship type model. So the learn by doing, the interpersonal thing was how I learned. And everybody who went through that process with me, a lot of us have said that it was because of that kind of experience that we're actually still in this field, because we've taken some punches between that day and now to the face. But one of the guys that trained us in that said, ministry happens in the context of relationships. We've already hit that nail several times today. Relationships are built on trust, and trust takes time. So pay the rent. And I think part of the rent of that here in terms of honing our own craft is opening ourselves up to feedback from people. Going maybe to somebody like Roger has been a mentor in my life. I'll go to him and ask him, hey, how have you done this? How have you done that? About life too. We had a conversation about marriage the other day. How do you do that? But also it's really wise, I think, as we get older, to ask the same questions of those who are younger than us, who may not have had as much experience as we have had too. I have 20-something-year-old colleagues that I will go to regularly and say, how do you do this? I'm taking notes on them. They have a different perspective on this, me sitting in the middle ground at 43 now. So how can I open myself up to feedback, invite somebody to listen to me do a pregame chapel, or watch me in a conversation and say, help me know. It's been in that avenue that I've been told, your energy is so great, but you need to slow down on these points because people are missing the boat. If I wouldn't open myself up to that, so it's been shadowing people. It's been inviting them into my space to watch me, to land the plane here, Roger, so you can go from this. The concept of discipleship in the Bible was all about following your rabbi, living with your rabbi 24/7, the dust of the rabbi on you. How do you do things like your rabbi does it? I think that's why Paul says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So to learn in an interpersonal way is central to our faith, not just our craft. Go ahead, Roger.
Very good. Appreciate that summary thought. And as we've talked about, how do we grow and develop in our roles as character coaches and sports chaplains, this has been hugely helpful. Thank you, Paul, for your participation, and Marla, thanks for Will coming along, and everybody else listening in. We're going to allow some time for some Q&A here at the end, but I want to wrap up the formal part of what we're doing by saying that next month on 6th January, we're going to talk about the idea of letters to my younger self. If you could go back 20 years and tell the guy that you were 20 years ago, hey, make sure you don't miss this, or be sure that you capitalize on this opportunity, or whatever. I'm thinking about me 27 years ago when I started. I just had a conversation this morning with the head coach that opened the door to me 27 years ago. We're still friends and colleagues, and But man, I made a lot of dumb mistakes. I'd like to know if I could tell that guy years ago, there would be some things I'd tell him now. That's what we're going to talk about, is what are those lessons to our younger selves that we might go back and tell someone coming up behind us. That'll come up on 6th January. Any final thoughts in summary, Paul?
I was just typing into the chat box just a couple book recommendations that
Perfect. Thank you.
that come to mind. So I'll put those in there. I think you all have covered really well. I think the importance of learning and growth and in some of those spaces where you can find it. And then, like I said, you're really providing that, even with this Zoom meeting and the other work that you do to equip and encourage chaplains. And you find diverse sources too to point people to. So I really appreciate the work that you both do in those spaces. With the 2 books I recommended, Jeremy Treat, Seek First, I found that to be really helpful. It's just an accessible introduction to help people see sort of the whole scope of God's vision for life in the kingdom, from Genesis to Revelation. It's written by a guy with a PhD, but he also played college basketball, so he's got a sports mind, and he writes that book in an accessible way. So it's a nice overview. And then the other book, James Smith, On the Road with St. Augustine, just read his chapter on ambition. And if you just read that chapter, because when you deal with sports people, ambition is really central to the drive that help athletes excel and grow. They want to win. His chapter on ambition is really helpful for people who are strivers and doers and achievers. So those 2 just stood to mind as a couple of practical resources.
Outstanding. That's most helpful. Thank you again, Paul, Marla, Will. Now,